against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
As the world watches and waits, even the American president is unaware of the two greatest dangers he's facing. Two secrets that won't be revealed for decades. Two stories of how close the world really came to all-out nuclear war. October 1962. Soviet ships carrying missiles approach Cuba. U.S. forces are at DEFCON 2, the highest state of alert ever. The next step, DEFCON 1, a shooting.
Kennedy declares a blockade, which is also an act of war, but he calls it a quarantine in order to make it seem a little more palatable.
More than 230 American warships spread out along the sea lanes into Cuba, awaiting the Soviet response. It will become one of the most famous moments of the Cold War. But it wasn't until 1992 that we found out the official version wasn't the whole story.
The Soviet ships are heading toward the quarantine line. A sub accompanying some of those ships is spotted by the American cruisers and destroyers.
The American ships start dropping special depth charges about the size of grenades.
The Soviets think that the United States is trying to sink them. But this is the beginning of the war. Why else would we be attacking a military vessel? They didn't realize that our protocol for a destroyer to make a subsurface is to drop sort of mock depth charges on it. Not trying to kill it, but to signal to it in a very rough way that they should surface.
We now know that was almost a fatal mistake.
The Americans had no idea that they had nuclear weapons on board.
Or that the sub's 3 senior officers had the authority to launch those nukes. But only if the decision was unanimous.
The Soviet commander gives the order to launch the nuclear torpedo.
One of the other high-ranking officers says, okay, that sounds good. And then the last high-ranking officer, a guy named Arkhipov, says, no, we're not going to do that. I will not approve of that. That's how close it comes. One vote, one person.
Another of the Cold War's biggest what-ifs.
Had that happened, they would have taken out the U.S. fleet. The U.S. would have definitely taken out Cuba, but very likely would have taken out the Soviet Union.
That wasn't the only near miss we didn't know about. Aerial reconnaissance had brought back evidence of missile site preparation in Cuba. If operational, they could strike almost anywhere in the United States. In response, American military leaders urged Kennedy to authorize an attack on mainland Cuba.
The military leaders want to bomb the missile sites and invade and overthrow the Cuban government. Kennedy resists.
In the days that follow, an American U-2 spy plane is shot down, and U.S. troops are ready for invasion. After a 13-day standoff, Kennedy and Khrushchev strike a deal. It's over. The Soviets pack up their nukes and go home. History records it as President Kennedy's finest hour. The day he stood up to the Soviets, kept nukes out of Cuba, and saved the world. But as so often in the atomic age, declassified secrets tell a very different story.
The biggest myth of the Cuban Missile Crisis that was common for decades and decades is that the United States stopped the Soviet Union from putting nuclear weapons on Cuba. It was not until the 1990s that we found out that we had not stopped them, that there were already nuclear weapons on the island.
Smaller, short-range tactical nuclear missiles. Battlefield nukes.
There were several operational missiles already ready to go that would have been used if the United States had attempted a military invasion of Cuba.
McNamara, when he heard that, he turned white.
Because as Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara knows how close America came to invading Cuba.
But if we had actually done that, we would have certainly gotten into at least a limited nuclear war, and that easily could have sped out of control into a much larger nuclear war.
Those 13 days in October brought us even closer than we ever thought to nuclear war. What we didn't know almost killed us.
The Cuban Missile Crisis was a great example of how a hair-trigger decision by a submarine captain or a battery defense unit on the island of Cuba could have precipitated a full-out conflict, potentially with a nuclear exchange, which thank God never happened.
When you're always prepared for a nuclear attack, it means you're always on the brink of World War III. And all it takes is one mistake for it to start. January 24th, 1961. 275 miles south of Washington, in Cairo, North Carolina, a U.S. Air Force B-52 declares an emergency. It carries two 4-megaton thermonuclear bombs, H-bombs. 260 times the explosive force of the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. The plane is part of an operation codenamed Chrome Dome.
This, our country and all its people, could be in danger of nuclear attack. In minutes by enemy missiles. In hours by enemy aircraft. To avoid surprise disaster, some of our aircraft must always be in the sky or on the alert, carrying nuclear weapons.
It's one of up to 12 B-52s carrying nuclear payloads that are in the air at all times, ready for the order to strike the Soviet Union.
They would fly up to the borders of the Soviet Union and turn around and come back.
The plan works to keep the Soviets on edge.
But there's a certain number of hours you can fly a bomber before you're going to expect it to crash.
Crashed bombers with nuclear payloads. Lost nukes. It happens often enough, there's a name for it.
The phrase broken arrow has to do with a nuclear weapon accident. To be a broken arrow, it has to, it's a pretty serious accident.
January 17th, 1966. Palomares, Spain. A small fishing village and beach town on the Mediterranean coast. An American B-52 carrying 4 H-bombs collides with a tanker at 29,000 feet and breaks up in midair.
Strategic Air Command bomber filled with bombs and dropped the weapons, some which landed on land and one that went into the Mediterranean.
The official line is that a plane has crashed and spread hazardous material on the ground. In fact, as the press finds out, a nuclear weapon is missing somewhere in the Mediterranean.
Cruisers and destroyers with sonar equipment have been trying to locate the lost bomb and also screening the approaches against enemy spies.
It takes 2 months just to find the sunken weapon. A mini-sub eventually hauls it to the surface. It was intact. But 2 of the other 3 bombs actually exploded. They became accidental dirty bombs, spreading traces of toxic plutonium dust for miles. American troops removed truckloads of contaminated dirt for months.
And this still goes on. I mean, I think we're still bringing back soil from Spain that is laden with plutonium. That's a serious health hazard.
At least all 4 bombs were recovered. Some broken arrows are never found.
There was another incident in 1968 in Fuel Greenland, which again, nuclear bombs were dropped.
A crippled B-52 patrolling near the Arctic Circle is attempting an emergency landing. The crew of 7 bails out. 1 dies. The plane crashes onto the sea ice. There's no nuclear detonation, but once again, the impact, conventional explosion, and resulting fire create the effect of a dirty bomb, spreading radioactive material for miles. Cleanup crews battle a frozen wasteland. Average temperature, -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Crews crews work around the clock to remove 250,000 cubic feet of contaminated ice and snow before it melts into the sea. The military claims all 4 nukes are recovered at the crash site. But a 2008 report alleges that one of the bombs still lies on the sea floor. Closer to home, in January 1961, in North Carolina, a B-52 attempting an emergency landing never makes it back to base.
This bomber sort of disintegrates into the air. It sort of breaks apart very violently, and these 2 weapons are sort of flung out of the bomber bay.
Pieces of the bomber rain down onto the small farming town of Fayrow. One bomb floats to Earth after its parachute deploys. The other crashes into a field. The Pentagon claims neither weapon was ever in danger of exploding. But a 2013 Freedom of Information request reveals that one of the weapons had virtually completed the arming sequence.
This bomb actually attempted to arm itself and fired. It went through just a very set of freak acts, and unfortunately didn't.
One switch like this one out of 4 prevents a nuclear disaster.
If that other small switch didn't hold, then that nuclear bomb would have detonated. We would have lost a significant portion of the east coast of the United States.
When its chute doesn't open, the second bomb slams into the ground, sinking more than 150 feet deep. It takes 3 days of frantic digging to find it.
They found that its switch, it was armed. So if that one switch had been in the other bomb at that time, the bomb would have completely legitimately thought that it was ready to explode.
The military removes the nuclear fuel at the bomb's core. But the uranium trigger is never located. A nuclear detonator is still buried in that North Carolina field. In 1968, Operation Chrome Dome, keeping nukes in the air 24/7, is abandoned. To date, the U.S. military admits to 32 broken arrows. Information about 21 has been declassified. 11 remain top secret.